She stood at the back door of a crowded restaurant, clutching her child with trembling arms, asking for what others threw away without a thought. Laughter cut through the air, whispers followed her steps, and humiliation burned hotter than hunger. Just when the manager raised his hand to throw her out, a calm voice from the corner stopped everyone cold. No one knew that the silent man watching her pain was a billionaire, and what he did next would turn her darkest moment into a miracle she never imagined. The evening air was sharp and unforgiving, the kind that slipped through torn clothes and settled deep into the bones. The city glowed with warm lights and laughter, but none of it belonged to her. She stood outside the restaurant, holding her little boy close to her chest, feeling the rise and fall of his shallow breaths. His stomach growled softly, a sound that made her heart ache more than any insult ever could. She whispered soothing words into his ear, though she had nothing left to offer except her voice and her love. Her name was Sarah, and just a year ago, her life had looked completely different. She had a small apartment, a modest job, and dreams she believed she could reach with enough effort. But life had a cruel way of pulling the ground out from beneath her feet. Her husband had died suddenly in an accident, leaving behind unpaid bills and unanswered questions. When illness followed grief and eviction followed illness, Sarah found herself on the streets with a child too young to understand why bedtime stories were now told under bridges. Tonight, hunger had finally pushed her to do what she had avoided for days. She had watched people enter the restaurant with neat clothes and easy smiles, watched plates of food pass by the windows, steaming and full. She knew restaurants threw away leftovers every night. She told herself she was not asking for money, not begging for charity, just food that would otherwise be wasted. Still, her feet felt heavy as she stepped inside, the warmth of the room wrapping around her like a reminder of everything she had lost. Conversations slowed as eyes turned toward her. Some faces showed annoyance, others discomfort, and a few carried open disgust. Sarah lowered her head and approached the counter, her voice barely audible. She asked politely, carefully, if there was any leftover food she could take for her child. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but she forced them out because her son's hunger mattered more than her pride. The manager looked her up and down, his expression hardening. "This isn't a shelter," he said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. A few people snickered. Someone muttered that she should get a job. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, her hands tightening around her child as if shielding him from the cruelty of the world. She tried to explain, her voice shaking, but the manager waved her off, already signaling toward the door. As she turned to leave, fighting tears, she felt smaller than she ever had before. Each step felt like a defeat, each stare like a reminder that society had already written her off. Her child looked up at her with innocent eyes and asked when they would eat. That single question shattered what little strength she had left. She swallowed hard, promising him soon, though she had no idea how she would keep that promise. What Sarah did not know was that someone else had been watching quietly from a corner table. The man wore a simple suit, well-fitted but unremarkable. He hadn't touched his food. His eyes followed Sarah, not with judgment, but with something heavier, recognition. He had grown up poor, remembered nights when hunger felt endless, when dignity was a luxury. While others saw an inconvenience, he saw a reflection of a past he had never forgotten. As the manager stepped forward to escort her out, the man finally stood. His chair scraped softly against the floor, a sound that somehow cut through the noise of the room. He spoke calmly, but there was an authority in his voice that demanded attention. "There's no need for that," he said, looking directly at the manager. The room fell silent. Sarah froze, unsure if she had done something wrong again. She turned slowly, meeting the stranger's gaze. There was no pity in his eyes, only quiet respect. He asked her name, asked about her child, and listened, truly listened, as she answered in a trembling voice. Every word felt like peeling back a wound, but something in his presence made it easier to speak. The manager tried to interrupt, but the man raised a hand gently, stopping him without a single harsh word. He looked around the restaurant, at the half-eaten plates and untouched meals, and then back at Sarah. "No one should be made to feel ashamed for being hungry," he said. "Especially not a mother trying to feed her child." Whispers spread through the room. Some faces shifted from amusement to discomfort. Sarah's heart pounded as she stood there, unsure of what would happen next. The man reached for his wallet, but instead of simply paying for food, he did something that made the entire room hold its breath. He invited Sarah and her child to sit, to eat properly, like human beings deserving of warmth and dignity. Tears slipped down Sarah's face as she nodded, unable to find words. For the first time in months, she felt seen, not as a burden, not as a problem, but as a person. She didn't know who the man was, didn't know that his name was known in boardrooms and headlines. All she knew was that in her darkest moment, a stranger had chosen kindness. And as she followed him to the table, unaware of how profoundly her life was about to change, the restaurant was no longer just a place of humiliation. It had become the starting point of a miracle neither she nor anyone else would ever forget. Sarah sat at the edge of a chair as if she might be asked to leave at any moment. Her hands rested protectively around her son, who stared at the table with wide eyes, confused by the sudden warmth and attention. The soft clinking of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation slowly returned around them, but the air felt different now, heavier with curiosity and unspoken questions. People pretended not to stare, yet their glances kept drifting back to the woman they had dismissed just moments earlier. The man signaled to a waiter with a calm nod. "Bring whatever the child wants," he said gently, then added, "and something warm for her too." His voice carried no hint of charity, no tone of superiority. It sounded like a simple request, the way one human being might speak to another. Sarah's throat tightened as she tried to thank him, but the words tangled with tears before they could escape. When the food arrived, the smell alone made her dizzy. Fresh bread, soup. Steaming softly, a small plate prepared carefully for her son. The child hesitated at first, looking up at his mother as if asking permission to believe this was real. Sarah nodded, brushing his hair back, forcing a smile even as her hands trembled. He took his first bite slowly, then faster, relief spreading across his small face. Watching him eat filled her with a mixture of joy and pain. Joy that he was finally full, pain that it had taken public humiliation to reach this moment. The man watched quietly, his expression unreadable. He did not rush them or fill the silence with unnecessary words. When Sarah finally began to eat, she realized how long it had been since she had tasted a hot meal. Each spoonful felt like a small mercy. She kept expecting someone to interrupt, to remind her she did not belong, but no one did. Even the manager stayed at a distance, his earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. After a while, the man spoke softly. He asked where she was staying, how long she had been on the streets. Sarah hesitated, shame rising instinctively, but something in his steady gaze encouraged honesty. She told him about her husband, about the accident, about losing everything one piece at a time. She spoke of nights spent holding her child to keep him warm, of promises whispered in the dark that she was terrified she could not keep. He listened without checking his phone, without glancing around the room. When she finished, there was a pause, not awkward, but heavy with understanding. "You're stronger than you realize," he said finally. "Surviving takes courage people rarely see." Sarah shook her head slowly. "It doesn't feel like strength," she replied. It feels like failing every day. Her voice cracked on the last word. The man leaned back slightly, folding his hands. Failure is giving up on your child, he said gently. You're still standing. That matters more than you know. Around them, a few diners had grown quiet, their earlier judgment replaced by something closer to reflection. A woman at a nearby table wiped her eyes discreetly. Another man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, staring down at his untouched food. The story unfolding in front of them was no longer entertainment or inconvenience. It was reality, raw and undeniable. When the plates were nearly empty, Sarah felt panic creep back in. This kindness, as precious as it was, felt temporary. She knew what would happen after. She would thank him, gather her child, and return to the cold streets. Miracles did not last. Life had taught her that much. She began to prepare herself emotionally, building the walls she had learned to rely on. But the man was not finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple business card, placing it on the table between them. Sarah glanced at it briefly, but did not really understand what she was seeing. The name meant nothing to her. The numbers were just numbers. Tomorrow morning, he said, go to this address. They'll be expecting you. Her heart raced. I don't understand, she said cautiously. Experience had taught her to be careful, even with kindness. It's a place where you and your son can rest, he replied. Clean clothes, a warm bed, food without having to ask. He paused, then added, and help finding your way back. Sarah stared at the card as if it might disappear. Why? She asked, barely above a whisper. You don't even know me. The man smiled faintly. I know hunger, he said, and I know what it feels like when the world looks away. She wanted to ask more, but something told her this was not a conversation meant to be forced. He stood, leaving money on the table, enough to cover far more than the meal. Before walking away, he knelt slightly to the child's level. Take care of your mother, he said kindly. The boy nodded solemnly, clutching his full stomach like a treasure. As the man left the restaurant, whispers erupted. Someone recognized his name. Another pulled out a phone, eyes widening. The realization spread like electricity. He was not just a generous stranger. He was a billionaire, known for his companies, his influence, his power. The same people who had laughed earlier now sat in stunned silence. Sarah remained seated, unaware of the full weight of that revelation. To her, he was simply the man who had seen her when everyone else had turned away. She held the business card tightly, as if it were a lifeline. Hope, fragile and frightening, stirred inside her chest. Outside, the cold still waited. Her problems were not magically solved yet. But as she stepped back into the night with her child fed and her heart slightly lighter, she realized something profound had shifted. For the first time in a long while, tomorrow did not feel like an enemy. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something she never dared to imagine. The building on the business card stood at the edge of the city, tall but quiet, nothing like the cold shelters Sarah had learned to avoid. She arrived early the next morning, her son half asleep in her arms, her heart pounding with doubt and fragile hope. Every step toward the glass doors felt unreal, as if she were walking into someone else's life. She expected security to stop her, expected someone to tell her there had been a mistake. Instead, a woman at the front desk smiled warmly and said her name, as if she had been expected all along. They were given clean clothes, a warm shower, and a small room that smelled faintly of soap and fresh linen. Sarah sat on the bed for a long moment, afraid to lie down, afraid that closing her eyes would break the spell. Her son bounced onto the mattress, laughing softly at the unfamiliar softness beneath him. That sound, pure, light, unburdened, made her turn away as tears streamed freely down her face. Later that day, she was asked to meet someone in a quiet office upstairs. Her hands shook as she smoothed her borrowed sweater, rehearsing words of gratitude and apology all at once. When the door opened and she saw the man from the restaurant standing by the window, sunlight outlining his calm silhouette, her breath caught. He turned and smiled gently, as if seeing her again was the most natural thing in the world. "I'm glad you came," he said. She nodded, suddenly overwhelmed. "I didn't know if I should," she admitted. "It felt too kind." He gestured for her to sit. "Kindness should never feel suspicious," he replied softly. "But I understand why it does." He explained then, not with pride but with quiet honesty, who he was and what he could offer. He told her about the foundation he had built to help families who had fallen through the cracks of the system. He spoke of resources, education, healthcare, temporary housing, but more than that, he spoke of dignity. "I don't want to save you," he said. "I want to support you while you save yourself." Those words settled into Sarah's heart in a way nothing else ever had. No one had spoken to her like that before. Not as a problem to be fixed, but as a capable woman who had simply been pushed too far by circumstances beyond her control. For the first time, she felt something stronger than hope. She felt belief. Over the following weeks, life began to shift slowly, almost cautiously. Sarah enrolled in training programs, rediscovering skills she thought she had lost. She attended counseling sessions that helped her untangle grief from guilt. Each morning, she woke up in a bed that was hers, even if temporarily. Each night, she tucked her son in without worrying about the weather or the police or where they would go next. The billionaire, whose name she now knew, though she rarely used it, visited occasionally. He never arrived with cameras or announcements. Sometimes he brought books for her son. Sometimes he simply asked how her day had been. They spoke about ordinary things, favorite foods, childhood memories, small dreams. He never reminded her of where she had come from, never used her story as a lesson for others. He treated her like a person, and that alone felt revolutionary. One afternoon, as they walked through a small garden behind the building, Sarah finally asked the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest. "Why me?" she said quietly. "You must see so many people who are struggling." He stopped, considering her words. "Because I saw myself in your child," he said after a moment. "And because I saw courage in you when others only saw inconvenience." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "And because sometimes one moment of compassion can change two lives, not just one." As months passed, Sarah found a job through the Foundation's network. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it came with stability. The first paycheck made her cry harder than the night she had been humiliated at the restaurant. This time, the tears were different. They were filled with relief, pride, and something close to joy. Yet despite the progress, fear still lingered. Trauma does not disappear simply because circumstances improve. There were nights when Sarah woke up gasping, convinced she was back on the streets. Each time, she reminded herself that this was real, that someone had chosen compassion when it mattered most. The public, meanwhile, had not forgotten the restaurant incident. A short video, taken quietly by a diner, began circulating online. It showed only fragments, the confrontation, the man standing up, the invitation to sit. People debated, criticized, praised. Some called it staged. Others called it proof that humanity still existed. Sarah avoided watching it. For her, the moment was not a spectacle. It was survival. One evening, as she watched her son sleep peacefully, she realized something profound. The miracle had not been the billionaire's wealth or power. It had been his willingness to see her suffering and act without hesitation. That single choice had rippled outward, reshaping her future. She placed a gentle kiss on her son's forehead and whispered a promise, not just to survive, but to live. To one day help someone else standing in the cold, afraid and unseen. And in the quiet of that room, surrounded by safety she was still learning to trust, Sarah understood that true humanity did not announce itself loudly. It appeared softly, in moments of compassion that changed everything. Life did not transform overnight into a perfect dream, but it began to settle into something steady, something real. Sarah learned the rhythm of normal days again, the comfort of routines, the quiet strength that came from small victories. She packed her son's lunch each morning, walked him to school with a hand tightly wrapped around his, and waved as he ran toward the building without fear. Every step he took away from her, confident and safe, healed a part of her that had been broken for too long. The foundation helped her move into a modest apartment not far from the school. It wasn't large, and the furniture was simple, but it was theirs. The first night they slept there, Sarah lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic. These ordinary noises felt extraordinary. She whispered thank you prayers into the darkness, not just for shelter, but for the chance to rebuild her dignity piece by piece. The billionaire continued to check in from time to time, though he never overstayed his presence. He understood something many powerful people did not, that help should empower, not control. During one visit, he noticed Sarah's nervous habit of apologizing for everything. "You don't have to be grateful every second," he told her gently. "You're allowed to just live." Those words stayed with her. She practiced them quietly, correcting herself each time she instinctively apologized for taking up space. Healing, she realized, was not only about escaping poverty. It was about reclaiming self-worth. As her confidence grew, Sarah began volunteering at a small community kitchen on weekends. She recognized the same hollow look in people's eyes that she once carried herself. When she served food, she made sure to look each person in the eye, to smile, to listen. Sometimes, all someone needed was acknowledgement. She never told her story unless asked. When she did, she spoke calmly, without bitterness, because she had learned that pain did not have to harden the heart. One afternoon, a woman came in holding a crying baby, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. Sarah felt something shift inside her. She stepped forward without thinking, guiding the woman to a seat, offering warm food and kind words. In that moment, Sarah understood what the billionaire had meant about compassion changing two lives. Giving back did not reopen her wounds, it strengthened her. Meanwhile, the world outside continued to buzz with opinions. Articles appeared, interviews were requested, and the billionaire was praised publicly for his act of kindness. He declined most of the attention. In one rare statement, he said simply, "This story isn't about me. It's about choosing humanity when it's easier to turn away." Sarah watched that interview alone, her heart full. She felt protected by his refusal to make her suffering a spectacle. There came a day when Sarah was invited to speak at a small event hosted by the foundation. She hesitated, fear tightening in her chest. Standing in front of people had once meant humiliation, but she thought of her son watching her, learning from her courage. So she agreed. When she stepped onto the stage, her hands trembled, but her voice found strength. She spoke about hunger, about invisibility, about the pain of being judged by a single moment. She spoke about how one act of kindness had given her room to breathe, to stand again. The room was silent, many eyes shining with tears. She was no longer ashamed of her past. It had become proof of her resilience. After the event, her son ran into her arms, proud and smiling. "You were brave, Mama," he said simply. That single sentence meant more to her than any applause. Later that evening, as the billionaire walked her to her car, she finally said what had been resting in her heart for months. "You didn't just help me survive," she said quietly. "You showed my son what kind of man he can be." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And you showed him what strength really looks like," he replied. Time continued to move forward. Sarah was promoted at work. Her son thrived in school. Laughter returned to their home, soft at first, then louder, freer. The scars of the past did not vanish, but they no longer defined her. They were reminders of how far she had come. One night, as she stood at her window watching the city lights, Sarah thought back to that restaurant. The cold stares, the burning shame, the moment she almost gave up hope. She realized now that the miracle had not erased her pain. It had transformed it into purpose. She whispered a promise to herself that she would never forget what it felt like to be invisible, and she would never allow herself to look away from someone else's suffering. Because humanity, she had learned, did not live in wealth or power. It lived in the choice to care. And that choice had changed everything. The years passed more quietly than Sarah ever expected, not marked by dramatic headlines or sudden miracles, but by steady progress and moments of deep, ordinary happiness. Life no longer felt like something she had to fight every second to keep. It felt like something she could finally live. Her son grew taller, stronger, his laughter filling the apartment they had long since made a home. He talked about school projects, favorite books, and dreams of what he wanted to become someday. Sometimes he said he wanted to help people. Sometimes he said he wanted to build things. Sarah listened with a full heart, knowing that whatever path he chose, it would be guided by empathy, not fear. Sarah herself continued to grow. She advanced at work, saved money carefully, and eventually no longer needed the foundation's support. The day she signed the final paperwork confirming her independence, she sat in her car afterward and cried, not from sadness, but from pride. She had made it, not because someone rescued her, but because someone had believed in her long enough for her to believe in herself. She still volunteered at the community kitchen, now as a coordinator. New volunteers often asked why she cared so deeply. She would smile and say, "Because no one should ever feel ashamed for being hungry." She never forgot the way it felt to stand in that restaurant, invisible and exposed, reduced to a problem instead of a person. That memory guided her hands, her words, her patience. One evening, the foundation hosted a small private dinner. No press, no speeches. Just people whose lives had intersected through acts of kindness. Sarah attended with her son, both dressed neatly but simply. When the billionaire arrived, there was no grand entrance. He greeted people quietly, listening more than speaking, just as he always had. When he reached Sarah, they shared a warm, familiar smile. "You look happy," he said. "I am," she replied honestly. "And I'm not afraid anymore." They sat together briefly, watching the room fill with soft conversation and gentle laughter. At one point, Sarah's son excused himself to play with other children. Sarah watched him go, then turned back to the man who had changed everything. "Do you know," she said softly, "that night at the restaurant, I was moments away from giving up. Not on life, but on people." He nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "And now I believe humanity still exists," she said. "Because of you." He shook his head slowly. "Because of us," he corrected. "I chose compassion. You chose courage. Both mattered." Later that night, as Sarah and her son walked home under the city lights, she felt a deep sense of peace. The city no longer felt cold or threatening. It felt alive, full of stories still unfolding. She realized that what had happened to her was not just a miracle, it was a responsibility. to see others, to speak up, to step forward when it mattered. Years later, Sarah would sometimes pass that same restaurant. The memory still surfaced, but it no longer hurt. Instead, it reminded her how quickly a single moment could change a life. She hoped that somewhere inside those walls, someone else would choose kindness over judgment. Because the truth she had learned was simple and powerful. You never know who is watching, and you never know how far one act of compassion can reach. On the night she tucked her son into bed and turned off the light, she whispered the same promise she had made long ago: to live with dignity, to love without fear, and to never look away from someone in need. And in that quiet room, filled with warmth and safety, the miracle completed its circle, not as a story of wealth or power, but as proof that true humanity still exists, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to choose it. If this story touched your heart, remember this: kindness costs nothing, but it can change everything. Somewhere right now, someone is standing in their darkest moment, hoping to be seen, hoping to be treated like a human being. Be the reason they believe humanity still exists. If you believe compassion is stronger than judgment, like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more heart-touching stories that remind us what truly matters. Because sometimes, one small act of kindness can become someone else's miracle. Red Heart.